Good morning, BookTube. This is ML Clark coming to you with Better Worlds Theory YouTube edition. I am joined as ever by the highway, which is outside my window, and which I hope will play nice this weekend. Last weekend, I sat down to record, and almost immediately there was the drone of horns from taxis and trucks in procession on the highway. I had not anticipated that there would be a massive national protest on a Sunday morning, because usually direct democracy takes forms that are meant to disrupt economic labor in a more meaningful manner, and that means weekdays, not weekends. Nevertheless, they had chosen the quietest day usually of the week, Ciclovia, a day in which half the highway is usually shut down for cyclists and runners and other people focused on wellness activities. And that's just how it goes sometimes. The decibel level was absolutely staggering. I couldn't hear myself think, let alone record. So that was a shot day. But in a way, it was absolutely perfect in its resonance with the themes of this video, of this particular topic, because I am Westerner. I am Canadian by birth, settler heritage, so 13 generations go back that way. Peace, order, and good government is a huge part of what Canadians are raised with, this sense of orderly conduct. And I am joined by a lot of people in North America in general who aren't necessarily used to other forms of democracy and other ways of feeling the social contract and civic action play out. Living in Colombia definitely opened me to a wide range of other alternatives, but I was aware that they existed before I moved. I moved in part because I wanted to break out of my paradigm, a really narrow paradigm in so many ways, that nonetheless sometimes convinces its citizens that it is the paradigm, the only way of thinking about a number of issues, not only surface issues in terms of politics, but also in terms of response to politics, how we negotiate power in our world. The reality is that all around the world there are many different forms of power discourse, and they're all playing out in the same planet in so many different ways concurrently, but our info silos often keep us from being exposed to the full range of possibilities and perspectives that might very well help to inform our own understanding of local context as well. So it has been a tremendous education. I've always been so grateful for it. Reading this book, which some of you might be able to see the cover of in the YouTube video, maybe some of you will not, The Saint of Bright Doors by Vajra Chandrasekera is the topic of this piece. It is a work I am so thankful exists. I'm so thankful got published. I'm so thankful has been acclaimed. It deserves the accolades that it is receiving. It is a nuanced work, and unfortunately the kind of work that it's doing is often not seen as valuable, and it's certainly not elevated the way it should be, in part because the narrative structure here does not match a lot of expectations in Western publishing. In some ways, there isn't enough action in this work. It's too cerebral in some ways, by some reckoning in North America. And it doesn't tidily resolve a lot of its threads. It has many different concepts that it raises, and then they just sit there on the page. Nothing is done about it. Nothing is wrapped up completely. And that's very maddening for a lot of us in the Western world. We like to think that we have very expansive forms of literature, but like anyone else in the world, we have rituals, routines, structures, paradigms that make us feel comfortable, that make us feel safe, and anything outside of it, like a disruptive motorcycle zipping by on my highway when I'm trying to make a point, doesn't fit the narrative and undermines the narrative. We don't see that the chaos is sometimes a part of that bigger weave. This work, landing on the list that it has, is wonderful. unto itself and also in terms of what it promises for work ahead. So I really want to recommend this work for a wide range of readers, but in doing so, I am especially going to push back on the way that it has been framed very much as a work of fantasy in certain modes, simply because I think it's being presented to Western readers, again, to try to fit into paradigms that we understand, when the work it's doing should push back on our understanding of paradigm entirely, hopefully, fingers crossed. To do that, though, I want to start not with the book, but with a wonderful work of criticism that came out last year by Gautum Bhatia, and it's published in Himal South Asian Magazine, and the piece is called Sri Lankan Speculative Fiction Lifts Off. So it's tying together a range of Anglophonic writing in the SF universe from Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka has a very rich and distinct history, and yet the funny thing I'm going to mention just before I leap into this criticism is when I was reading The Saint of Bright Doors, I resonated so much with certain elements simply because I also live in another space that carries these compacted histories of colonialism everywhere. It's in the architecture here just as it is in the architecture for the work in question. Even the title, The Saint of Bright Doors, is referring to a kind of body of infrastructure that exists in certain cities more than others. Anyone who's maybe traveled to spaces with Spanish colonial design might recognize the kind of work being discussed. But there are these intricate doorways, beautiful reminders that you can clear out the people who have colonized and sometimes think, okay, the architecture can stay, it's not bad. And as a result, in Colombia, there are a lot of bright doors as well. There are a lot of echoes of this other era carried forward. And just like in the work itself, many of these are beautiful doors, closed, locked, padlocked for years, decades. And so one of the major motifs in this work, which informs a lot of the narrative, is not just Sri Lanka, it's also a lot of the world that has moved through colonization and continues to negotiate many layers of history in a quote-unquote post-colonial context, or maybe differently colonial context, depending on how you see the world today. So even from the beginning, when I was saying that Gautam Bhatia has written about a body of Sri Lankan literature, it's to create a context, it's to create a sense that this work is not token, it's not just there randomly to check off a box, but belongs to a tradition. And even then, I want to emphasize that tradition goes much further than even the South Asian context or the Sri Lankan context in which it's been set. And of course, that comes up in the piece as well, as you will see. I'll put it in the notes for this YouTube video, because one other aspect that is highlighted by Bhatia and has come up in many places, but definitely deserves to be mentioned as often as possible, is that Western readers can sometimes be surprised to see references to Western work in a non-Western context. In large part because although the West doesn't necessarily read the rest of the world still reads the West, and sometimes reads it better. I mentioned this when I was in a review of Hao Jingfang's Vagabonds, which is a piece in which you have Chinese, it's written originally in a Chinese context, and it imagines Mars and Earth both manifesting very different political ideologies. So all of Earth is pretty much capitalist, and all of Mars is a very scientific communism. But one of the key components is that the youth who go to Earth experience capitalism and then come back are in some ways better positioned to reflect on the differences between the two worlds than people on Earth might have been if they had done the journey in reverse, simply because some educations will expose you to more outside contexts or classics than others. And so it's very complicated when we talk about notions of propaganda, and which absolutely exist, because we can sometimes be caught off guard by how broad another canon still is, even when we might consider it from an inferior context, a less educated context, or a context with fewer possibilities, doesn't necessarily mean it is without awareness of the world at large. Okay, so with all that in mind, I am just trying to get to a key section here, which I would love to read from. I'm going to read actually a few paragraphs, just because it helps also to introduce the novel itself and my main topic, which is about the way that genre has been foisted sometimes, I think, incorrectly on this work. So, as Bhatia writes, The Saint of Bright Doors is set in a secondary fantasy world of competing religious orders with a neo-imperial metropolis called Luriat that carries on an extractive relationship with the island's hinterland and underground resistance movements that seethe against the combination of state power and organized religion that rules the land through some velvet and a lot of iron. Into the backwaters of this world is born Feder, who finds his way to Luriat and falls in with the resistance, only to discover that their primary antagonist, the island's most powerful religious figure, is none other than his own father. The surface-level callbacks to modern-day Sri Lanka are evident from this summary, but they also go much deeper. Unlike much of modern fantasy, produced by writers who belong to more secularized societies, for better or for worse, religious violence is front and center in The Saint of Bright Doors. This harkens, as Chandrasekera pointed out to me, to the use of religion as an apparatus of racialization, much as Buddhism has been employed in Sri Lanka. Alongside this is the role of caste, sometimes also pronounced caste. One of the book's most striking passages reads, The granular nature of violence in Luriat finds its mirror in the narratives of micro-resistance dusted throughout the book and also in its analysis of power. Unlike the monolithic imperial structures of power that are characteristic of much contemporary fantasy, including interpersonal relationships that extend such structures, for instance those between colonizers and the colonized, Luriat experiences what historians have referred to as a layered sovereignty. State power exists, but it is in constant competition with other sources of power, both in terms of material supremacy as well as normative legitimacy. Quote, Power produces us even as we produce it, unquote. Chandrasekera noted, and in that sense, The Saint of Bright Doors is a nuanced exploration of how no one individual or groups of individuals can ever stand outside the prevailing power structure or seek to remake it through acts of individual will or heroism. Wonderful summary, and I'll leave it there, but the piece is fantastic. It introduces many other works that I also think should have been acclaimed more. The Salvage Crew in particular is just absolutely wonderful, but if you're trying to pitch a work that is a poetic sci-fi, that's an especially difficult sell in a lot of the Western publishing universe. But this last part, these 3 paragraphs, introduce the book in terms of the overarching thrust of story and get to the key component of why I really want us to think about The Saint of Bright Doors not as a work of genre fiction, not as a work of speculative fiction in a very commercial way, but as a work of fiction, as a work of literature that deserves to be read in a way that doesn't try to push it into a sense of, is this allegory, is this a specific subgenre, and just read for what it can tell us about something deeper. Because that last component, that last line in Bhatia's essay, he says how no one individual can ever stand outside the prevailing power structure or seek to remake it through acts of individual will or heroism, stands at such a remove from the way that most Western literature likes to tell its stories in the modern context, in a commercial context. There is plenty of literature that is without agency or with limited agency, but there is a kind of genre fiction that needs to sell you not just on the story, but on the idea that the individual, the protagonist, is someone you should automatically be rooting for, and who will carry the day no matter what. One of the really wonderful parts of The Saint of Bright Doors, which I will discuss more in my newsletter this week, is the way that it presents these narrative possibilities. This child Fetter, not a child for most of the book, but starts as a child, is first given a narrative of destiny by his mother. And there is a resonance in this context, even though the context is a little bit fantastical, with the way we are all born into certain contexts where the first person, our first storytellers, give us a sense of destiny, give us a sense of place that later experiences in the world are going to question or confound, if not directly, then through the realization that other people also had their first stories told to them as they were children that also confronted the complicating realities of a broader sphere. So we are first definitely imbued as children with a sense of our distinct destiny, our distinct sense of self, and a lot of Western literature, especially within commercial science fiction and fantasy, loves to lean on that, to affirm that idea of, yes, that first story might have been the most important story in your life, or if not, the story you find when you were a young adolescent, that will be the story that defines the rest of your life. And this is a mode that we're quite comfortable with for two reasons. One, because it affirms that first body of experiences and stories in our lives, and also because it gives us an understanding of power in our society that allows us to feel like we have a lot more agency, even if we don't necessarily have the ability to change the world. What this causes, and what I think we've definitely seen a lot of in recent years, is profound frustration when that will to power in our lives doesn't manifest in worldly change, when we can't just suddenly push a little bit or articulate ourselves or manifest our strongly held subject position and see real change around us. I think a lot of the demoralization we feel, a lot of the disillusion we feel in society comes from the fact that our Western narratives have not necessarily served to empower us. They've offered us this sort of loose idea of power on page and a sense of affirmation on the page, and it can be stimulating and exciting in the moment, but does it translate, or does the quote-unquote magic, the fantasy of the work on page translate to the rest of our lives? In this case, and we're not going to do any spoilers whatsoever for the book, it does not. And the character moves through attempts to create destiny for themselves and different roles within a much more complex society as they are navigating their young adult life. And even then, the real story of change is something that happens at a remove from their own perceived path of agency. And again, if I say anything more than that, I will spoil the ending, which is, I don't want to say it like it's a gotcha ending, but the ending arrives so beautifully as a kind of synthesis of other comments that exist throughout the work that it is just quite pleasant to experience it on your own. I highly recommend The Saint of Bright Doors, but I'm not recommending it as a work of fantasy. And that ties into the reason I brought up Bhatia's essay in the first place. It can be so easy in the West for us to graft a notion of fantasy onto positions that already exist in our world. And I think there is a danger in that. I think there's an opportunity for fiction like this, especially when it is so well acclaimed and so there's no excuse not to spend time with it, to really reflect on the paradigms and the stories that we grew up with, and to ask ourselves in conversation, in dialogue with something a little different, if those stories still hold. The Saint of Bright Doors is not nearly as fantastical as it's sometimes made out to be. And I would caution people who create a notion of it being fantastical because of certain elements of city design or the way that power functions. As Bhatia points out, a lot of that power, that quote-unquote layered sovereignty, is just part of the water in which many cultures swim. Around the world, there are so many societies with these overlapping senses of self and competing assertions of different religious and political movements to try to create the narrative, the cohesive synthesis of culture that might move a society towards something more stable. Another element in the paragraphs that I mentioned was this notion of secularized societies, and we do have a very streamlined form in our cultures. We have a tendency to treat different groups as hive minds instead of many fractured factions that are trying to give voice to the overall movement, to be charismatic enough to represent the entire movement. And we do ourselves a disservice as humans when we fail to see just how complex power is in all of our cultures. So again, I think my ultimate push with this piece is certainly read it. Read it as literature. Read it as something that talks about power, that talks about our relationship to power, our understanding of story, and how story can be given to us as something that's meant to push back on power, but with varying levels of success. And ultimately, not to read this as a work of fantasy or pleasure, although it certainly is an enjoyable read, but as something that might also open us to a way of moving in our own worlds that better accords with the reality of our own worlds. Western publishing models with that very affirming sense of individual will to power and agency, and very clean divides between different kinds of power and different kinds of action groups in our society, doesn't actually match what we're seeing in the world around us. And a lot of our panic and our disillusionment might very much simply be a manifestation of the fact that we are not telling the stories that we need to within our own paradigms, using our own fractured histories to meet the world where it is. So sometimes, instead of going to a secondary world entirely, we need only go to an alt universe a little bit adjacent to our own, just from some other part of the planet, to find the narrative thrust that might sing us all home. And that is my advocacy for this piece. I also highly recommend Bhatia's essay with all of its recommendations of other reads, and I will follow this up by a deeper analysis, not too deep, but a little bit deeper, of some of the themes in this work on the newsletter for those interested. Thank you very much for your time, and I think there might have been some dog barking, a little bit of motorcycle, but I didn't hear another major protest, so congrats to all of us on that. Take good care of yourselves, and whatever you're reading this week, please do read with full pleasure. It doesn't need to be an education in the world all the time. Nonetheless, if you are inclined, definitely try to move a little bit outside of your usual wheelhouse to see if maybe there's something in another paradigm that might help you find the vocabulary to move better within your own. Take care, folks. Until next week.